Scary story: the whispering illness. The town of Havenwood, nestled deep in the verdant embrace of the Appalachian foothills, had always been a place of quietude, a sanctuary where life moved at a slower pace and secrets were buried deeper than the roots of the ancient oaks that lined its streets. Until the whispers came. It started subtly, with reports of insomnia and heightened anxiety. Then came the headaches, persistent and throbbing, that refused to yield to conventional remedies. Soon, people began complaining of hearing things, faint whispers, just at the edge of their hearing, indecipherable but unnerving. Dr. Emily Carter, the town's only physician, initially dismissed the symptoms as stress-related. Havenwood had always been a tight-knit community, but the recent influx of tourists drawn to the newly discovered Havenwood Caverns had strained the town's resources and disrupted its peaceful rhythm. The caverns, a vast and intricate system of underground tunnels and chambers, had been hailed as a natural wonder, a geological marvel that promised to revitalize Havenwood's economy. But as the tourists flocked in, so did the uneasiness. The whispers became more frequent, more insistent, and more sinister. People started acting strangely, withdrawn, paranoid, quick to anger. Neighbors turned on each other, friendships dissolved, and the once harmonious community began to unravel. The first act of violence occurred on a balmy Tuesday afternoon. Mr. Abernathy, the town's beloved librarian, calmly walked into the town square and set himself on fire, screaming about voices telling him to cleanse himself of sin. The community was stunned, reeling from the shock of the act. Emily, however, recognized a pattern. She had interviewed Mr. Abernathy just days before, and he had complained of hearing whispers, voices that told him he was evil and unworthy. Emily began to investigate, interviewing other residents who had reported similar symptoms. She discovered that the whispers were always negative, always demeaning, always urging the victims to inflict harm upon themselves or others. The violence escalated. Mrs. Henderson, the local baker, poisoned her entire family before turning the knife on herself. Young Timmy Johnson, a bright and cheerful boy, shot his classmates at the elementary school. Each act was preceded by reports of the whispers. Fear gripped Havenwood, a suffocating blanket that stifled hope and reason. The town was placed under quarantine, the roads blocked, the internet and phone lines cut off. Havenwood was isolated, left to fend for itself against the unseen enemy. Sheriff Daniel Boone, a man hardened by years of law enforcement, found himself facing a threat he couldn't comprehend. He tried to maintain order, to protect the town, but the whispers were insidious, reaching into the minds of his deputies, turning them against each other. Daniel, a man of faith, sought solace in the church, but even the sanctuary was not immune. Father Michael, the town's priest, became convinced that the whispers were the voice of God, testing their faith, urging them to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Emily, desperate to find a cure, turned her attention to the Havenwood Caverns. She suspected that the caverns were the source of the whispers, that some unknown force within the earth was driving the town mad. She enlisted the help of Dr. Alistair Reed, a geologist from Miskatonic University, who had been studying the caverns for years. Alistair, a brilliant but eccentric scientist, was fascinated by the caverns' unique geological formations and the presence of rare minerals. Together, they ventured into the caverns, determined to uncover the truth. The caverns were dark and labyrinthine, their walls dripping with moisture, their silence broken only by the echo of their footsteps. As they delved deeper into the caverns, they noticed something strange. The air grew colder, the silence more profound, and they began to hear things. Faint whispers, just at the edge of their hearing, indecipherable but unnerving. Emily and Alistair exchanged a nervous glance. They were being infected. They pressed on, following a narrow tunnel that led to a vast, underground chamber. In the center of the chamber, they found it. A large, pulsating mass, covered in strange symbols. It glowed with a faint, ethereal light, and it seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy. Alistair recognized it instantly. It was a unique mineral formation, unlike anything he had ever seen. He called it Whisperstone. "This is it, Emily," Alistair said, his voice filled with awe and fear. "This is the source of the whispers." Emily approached the Whisperstone cautiously. As she got closer, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer indecipherable. They were speaking her name. They were telling her things. Terrible things. They were urging her to do things. Horrible things. Emily recoiled, her hand flying to her head. The whispers were overwhelming, threatening to drown out her. The pressure in her skull mounted, a vice tightening with each insidious syllable. The Whisperstone pulsed, its ethereal glow intensifying, and Emily felt her resolve crumbling, her sanity fraying at the edges. The whispers weren't just urging her, they were showing her. Visions flashed before her eyes, her hands, stained crimson, the faces of her loved ones, contorted in agony. "Alistair," she gasped, her voice strained, "we need to get out of here. Now." Alistair, however, was transfixed. He approached the Whisperstone, his eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and terror. He reached out his hand, as if drawn by an irresistible force. "Alistair, no," Emily cried, but it was too late. Alistair touched the Whisperston. A jolt of energy surged through his body, sending him reeling backward. His eyes glazed over, his body shuddered violently, and then he went still. Emily rushed to his side, but it was no use. Alistair was gone. His mind, his soul, had been consumed by the Whisperston. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. She was alone, trapped in the caverns with the source of the madness, with the whispers that threatened to destroy her. She knew that she had to escape, but the whispers were relentless, pulling her towards the Whisperston, urging her to embrace the darkness. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the voices, trying to cling to her sanity. She thought of her family, of her friends, of the town she had sworn to protect. She couldn't let the whispers win. She had to fight. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the Whisperston. She knew that she couldn't destroy it, not with her bare hands. But perhaps she could contain it. She remembered Alistair's research, his notes on the rare minerals found in the caverns. One mineral in particular, a type of crystalline quartz, was known to absorb and neutralize certain types of energy. If she could find enough of that quartz, she might be able to create a barrier around the Whisperston, preventing it from spreading its influence. It was a long shot, but it was her only chance. She turned and fled, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find the quartz. She had to save Havenwood. As she ran through the caverns, she could hear the whispers growing louder, more insistent. They were taunting her, mocking her, telling her that she was doomed, that she couldn't escape. But she refused to listen. She clung to her hope, to her determination, to her love for Havenwood. She found a small vein of quartz embedded in the wall of a narrow tunnel. She used her pocket knife to pry it loose, her hands trembling with exhaustion and fear. The quartz was small, barely enough to fill her pockets, but it was a start. She continued her search, venturing deeper into the caverns, her body aching, her mind fraying. She found more quartz, a little at a time, gathering it in her pockets, her backpack, her every available space. As she gathered the quartz, she could feel its energy, a calming, soothing force that helped to quiet the whispers, to restore her sanity. She knew that she was getting closer to her goal. She could almost feel the barrier forming around her mind, a shield against the madness. But then, she heard it. Footsteps, coming towards her through the caverns. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't the creature, or what she assumed was the former Alistair. This was something different. These were deliberate, trained steps. She knew who it was. Sheriff Daniel Boone. He had succumbed to the whispers, just like the others. She had to avoid him. She couldn't let him stop her from containing the Whisperston. She hid in a small alcove, her breath held, as Daniel passed by, his eyes vacant, his face expressionless. She waited until he was gone, then continued her search. Finally, she had enough quartz. Her backpack was overflowing, her pockets bulging. She could barely carry it all, but she knew that it was enough. She returned to the chamber where the Whisperston pulsed. Her returning to the cavern felt like stepping into the heart of a storm. The whispers crashed around her, a cacophony of hate and despair. But armed with the quartz, she could stand firm, a small island of sanity in a sea of madness. She started placing the quartz around the Whisperston, carefully arranging the crystals to form a protective circle. As she did so, she could feel the energy of the quartz flowing into the stone, dampening its power, quieting the whispers. The Whisperston pulsed violently, as if resisting her efforts. The light grew brighter, the whispers louder. Emily gritted her teeth, her hands shaking with exhaustion and fear. She had to finish the circle. She had to contain the madness. Just as she placed the last piece of quartz, she heard a voice behind her. "Emily," Daniel said, his voice cold and emotionless. "What are you doing?" She turned and saw him standing in the entrance to the chamber, his eyes vacant, his face expressionless. He held his gun, pointing it directly at her. "Daniel, please," she said, her voice pleading. "Don't do this. You don't understand what's happening." Daniel didn't answer. He simply raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Emily knew that she couldn't reason with him. He was completely under the influence of the whispers. She had to act fast. She grabbed a handful of quartz and threw it at Daniel, hitting him in the face. He staggered back, momentarily stunned. Emily seized the opportunity and ran towards him, tackling him to the ground. They wrestled for the gun, their bodies rolling across the cavern floor. The whispers screamed in her ears, urging her to kill him, to silence him forever. But she resisted. She couldn't kill Daniel. He was her friend, her neighbor, a good man corrupted by the whispers. She managed to wrestle the gun away from him and throw it as far as she could. Daniel lunged at her, his hands reaching for her throat. Emily fought back, kicking and punching, desperate to defend herself. She managed to break free from his grasp and scrambled to her feet. Daniel stood up, his eyes filled with rage. He lunged at her again, his hands outstretched. Emily knew that she couldn't fight him. She was exhausted, injured, and overwhelmed by the whispers. She had to find another way. She looked at the circle of quartz surrounding the Whisperston. She knew that it was her only chance. She ran towards the Whisperston, ignoring Daniel's shouts, ignoring the whispers that screamed in her ears. She reached the circle of quartz and knelt down, placing her hands on the crystals. She closed her eyes and focused all of her energy, all of her will, on containing the Whisperston. She could feel the energy of the quartz flowing through her, calming her mind, strengthening her resolve. She could feel the Whisperston resisting, pulsing with all of its power, trying to break free from her control. But she held firm. She refused to yield. She poured all of her love, all of her hope, all of her compassion into the crystals, using them to channel her energy into the Whisperston. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to gain control. The whispers grew quieter, the light grew dimmer, the pulsing became less violent. Daniel watched her, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. He didn't understand what she was doing, but he knew that it was changing something. As Emily continued to focus her energy, she could feel the tide turning. The Whisperston was weakening, its power waning. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the Whisperston went silent. The light faded completely, and the pulsing stopped. The whispers were gone. Emily collapsed to the ground, exhausted and spent. She had done it. She had contained the Whisperston. She had saved Havenwood. Daniel knelt beside her, his eyes filling with tears. The influence of the whispers had lifted. The influence of the whispers had lifted, leaving him disoriented and filled with remorse. He stared at Emily, a wave of shame washing over him as he recalled his actions under its thrall. Emily, I don't know what came over me, he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. Emily, still weak but relieved, managed a small smile. It wasn't you, Daniel, she said, her voice raspy. It was the Whisperston. He helped her to her feet, and together they surveyed the chamber. The cavern was eerily silent, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by a sense of peace. The only light came from their flashlights, illuminating the circle of quartz that now contained the Whisperston, a silent sentinel of a threat contained. What do we do now? Daniel asked, his gaze fixed on the stone. Emily sighed, exhaustion etched on her face. We have to seal the caverns, she said. Permanently. They knew it wouldn't be an easy task. The Havenwood caverns were a natural wonder, a source of pride and economic prosperity for the town. But the risk of the whispers resurfacing was too great. Together, they left the chamber and began to make their way back to the entrance of the caverns, their steps slow and deliberate. The journey was uneventful, the silence broken only by their heavy breathing and the occasional drip of water. As they emerged from the caverns into the cool night air, they were met with a scene of devastation. The town of Havenwood was in ruins, buildings burned, streets littered with debris, and the air thick with the stench of smoke and decay. The survivors, those who had managed to resist the whispers, huddled together in the town square, their faces etched with grief and despair. They had witnessed the horrors that had unfolded, the violence, the madness, the destruction of the beloved town. Emily and Daniel joined them, their hearts heavy with sorrow. They knew that the road to recovery would be long and difficult, but they also knew that they couldn't give up. They had to rebuild Havenwood, to heal its wounds, to restore its peace. In the days that followed, they worked tirelessly alongside the survivors, clearing debris, tending to the injured, and burying the dead. They organized food and shelter, established a sense of order, and began to address the psychological trauma that had gripped the town. Emily shared her knowledge of the Whisperston, explaining the nature of the threat and the steps they needed to take to prevent it from resurfacing. She proposed a permanent sealing of the Havenwood caverns, a measure that was met with mixed reactions. Some residents, still scarred by the events that had transpired, wholeheartedly supported the plan. They wanted to eradicate any trace of the evil that had consumed their town. Others, however, were hesitant. They viewed the caverns as a symbol of hope, a source of economic prosperity that could help Havenwood rebuild. They argued that sealing the caverns would be a betrayal of their history and a death knell for their future. Daniel, drawing on his authority as sheriff and his newfound understanding of the threat, mediated the debate, urging the residents to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. Ultimately, the decision was made to seal the Havenwood caverns, not with explosives or concrete, but with a carefully constructed network of quartz crystals, mirroring the barrier that Emily had created around the Whisperston. The townspeople worked together, hauling the crystals to the entrance of the caverns, arranging them in a precise formation under Emily's guidance. The act was both symbolic and practical, a testament to their resilience and their determination to protect their town from future harm. As the last crystal was placed, a sense of peace settled over Havenwood. The air seemed clearer, the sky brighter, and the whispers, once a constant presence, were finally silenced. Havenwood would never be the same. The scars of the whispering illness would forever be etched on the town's collective memory. But it had survived, it had endured, and it had learned a valuable lesson, that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the power of community, compassion, and unwavering resolve can prevail. And Emily, forever changed by her experience, became a guardian of Havenwood, a protector of its secrets, and a beacon of hope for its future. She often found herself looking toward the sealed entrance of the caverns, remembering the terror and the madness she had faced within. She also remembered Alistair, who had lost himself to the whispers. Each year, she placed flowers near the hidden entrance, a reminder for what had happened and why she continued to watch. She knew that the whispers might return, and she would be ready to face them. She felt the responsibility now more than ever. For herself, for Daniel, for Alistair, and for Havenwood, they could never let the evil come back.